All right, Matthew, thank you again. And what I thought I would do is, just pray real quick, and then we'll jump into introductions. I'll read our so-called voter guide, and then we can free flow from there. Just so happy to optimize and maximize the time you've given us. So let me just pray, and we'll jump in. I know this is sensitive issues, as you could probably agree. Jesus, thank you so much for just this conversation. I know it's near and dear to both of our hearts, and to the listener, God, who's maybe feeling really sensitive about this subject of immigration, concerned, worried, afraid, confused. And I just ask in Jesus' name that there would be such a tremendous wave of clarity that comes from this conversation today. Thank you for your hand of blessing on Matthew and on me. Lord, thank you for the wisdom and grace that's going to come through on the audio and video. And we just pray that the intent of this whole thing is helpful and constructive for someone who really is confused or hasn't made up their mind. So help us do that today. In Jesus' name, amen. So Matthew, I'm going to ask you to just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you. Tell us everything you've ever done starting at age 10. Is that okay?
How long you have? My name is Matt Soerens. I serve at World Relief as the Vice President of Advocacy and Policy. I've been at World Relief almost 20 years now, from starting as an intern when I was a student at Wheaton College in our program in Nicaragua, and then joined our staff in the Chicagoland area and our immigration legal services team. And for more than a decade now, I've been focused in some way or another on issues of public policy from a distinctly Christian perspective. How do we apply the Bible to both the dynamics of immigrants moving into our neighborhood, but also to the question of public policy that affects refugees and other immigrants. And I live in Aurora, Illinois, outside of Chicago, with my wife, Diana, and we've got 4 kids. And that's sort of the short version of my bio.
That's awesome. I have several points that we're going to follow up on later. We need to make room for the kids conversation, and also for just how much of a local neighboring conversation this can churn into, and we need to get curious about that. And we definitely want to help our people here in Costa Mesa be open to that and embrace that type of thing. So we're going to come back to all of that in a moment. I'm going to do the same thing we've said we would do for each one of these so-called voter guide issues. I'm going to read a couple qualifiers, and then I'm going to read the draft on immigration, and I'm going to invite you, Matthew, to just have your way, man. I mean, something you didn't like maybe that I wrote, or that you would add or nuance, and we'll go from there. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that's great.
Cool. And so I'm going to confess that in this intro of qualifiers, I'm borrowing a lot of this from Pastor Tyler out of Bridgetown Church in the Pacific Northwest. I just think some of this language is so useful. Some of it is distinctly ours. But the first thing I'm going to say to the listener is try using the lens of Christ. And I think we have a challenge in this political moment where we use the lens of politics first as the first filter, and then Jesus second. We want to right side that. So that's first one. Second one, this really comes from Tyler. Be aware of your baggage. I love what he says. He says it's totally fine to have baggage, but it's a dangerous thing to be unaware of that baggage. So we're all safe to be in process. I hope people will give me grace to be in process, but just even beware of the baggage that can create a lens as well. Back to point number 1. Point number 3, it's helpful to locate the weight that this voter issue should carry. It may have a certain weight, too little or too great, but to kind of figure that out and then realize, this is from Gary Brashears, whether it's something you're willing to die for, divide for, debate for, or decide for. That's the question we want to help you kind of wrestle through in this conversation. Point number 4, Romans 14 is a wonderful framework for us in this discussion. It just means, I'm just going to read the first part of it. Now receive the one who is weak in the faith and do not have disputes over differing opinions. Who are we to pass judgment on another servant? So it's just he's kind of, this verse, Matthew, I know, and it's just a great reminder to say, hey, some of us are newer to the faith, some of us are newer to this political issue, and let us maintain the unity and the bond of peace. Finally, number 5, We framed these entire voter guide issues to be helpful, not divisive or polarizing. We want to help those who are undecided, confused, or maybe even misled. And there's this wonderful, wonderful post from the famous guy, Atomic Habits. Do you know this guy, Matthew? I'm going to have to cite him in the show notes, but he talks about people who may or may not want to change their mind. Listen to this. Faced with a choice between changing one's mind and proving there is no need to do so, almost everyone will get busy with the proof that there's no need to change your mind. So he goes on to say, this is James Clear, by the way. If we're not careful, we can fall into the trap of being factually false, but socially accurate. And boy, that I know that probably resonates, right, Matthew? Because you've seen people who so desperately want to fit in with the tribe mentality, and they're willing to be factually wrong. I mean, know what your book, and we'll get to it, Welcoming the Stranger, is just like, it's objective. It's just so objective. So we're going to get there in just a moment. So finally, the values for our conversation, we want to be prayerful, biblical, and respectful. Before I read the statement, anything you would add to that or comment, Matthew?
No, I mean, I really appreciate that framing. And I think even we'll dive into issues of immigration, but there's a lot of space for disagreement on the details of policy. I mean, I think you should be wary of anyone who tells you the Bible says the United States must bring 125,000 refugees to the United States, or people with this felony conviction must be deported, but people with this other criminal issue need not be deported. Like, the Bible just doesn't give us that specificity of policy. That's not to say that we can't use our brains that God has given us and some biblical principles to think about some of those dynamics. But I also think sometimes while we're focused on policy, we skip over the things that the Bible is actually much more clear on, which is how do you treat your neighbor who may be an immigrant, in various backgrounds, countries of origin, legal statuses, all those questions. And I think I want to avoid either falling into the trap of saying, "Thus saith the Lord," on something that the scriptures don't speak to, or saying the Bible isn't relevant to this discussion, which it really very clearly is. The Bible has so much to say very specifically about how to treat our neighbors. And then I think some prudential wisdom that can inform how we think about the policy discussions.
Excellent. That is so spot on. And I'm feeling at least a little bit more consoled about what we wrote here, because we're trying to point to that same thing. So without further ado, let's read this, and then I'd love to get your input. Immigration is another basically clear issue, at least if you're a reader of the whole Bible. Here are a few examples. Genesis 23:4, I am a stranger and an alien residing among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, so that I may bury my dead out of my sight. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Deuteronomy 10:19. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. That's a big one. Leviticus 19, it's where we get the great command, right? And then Deuteronomy 27. Cursed is anyone who withholds judgment from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. So again, we could go on and on for this, but it's very clear that from the earliest records, our God makes provisions for the foreigner, the stranger, the alien. So national hospitality is important, right? Right. But the way we welcome the stranger matters too, doesn't it? So the Bible, new and old, is loud and clear on the record of foreigners. It's also quite clear about the concepts of law and order. There's a difference between immigration and legal immigration. And some of these references about maybe law and order. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the creation narrative. It's obviously filled with order. Hebrews 11:3, by faith we understand that the worlds were set in order at God's command. Isaiah 40:12, who has measured out the waters in the hollow of his hand, or carefully measured the sky? So there's all these exact measurements that God is sovereign over. In Scripture, we see divine order in everything. And in fact, he's a God of tremendous law and order. Does the Bible have a lot to do with the law? You bet it does. This is usually known as Torah, the ancient law, the gospel, which James calls the royal law or the law of liberty in the New Testament. The word law is used hundreds of times in the Bible, and even though these are very distinct forms of biblical law, I want to say that, I want to affirm that. You probably do, Matthew, as well. It's distinct from secular laws of the land. We do believe one may infer some things about America's governing laws, just as the founders of this incredibly unique nation did hundreds of years ago. Just 3 more paragraphs. Let us take a more explicit swing into the candidates once more. One of them represents a party that would appear more benevolent and hospitable to the foreigner or the alien. The other has, in part, made a name for himself regarding the amount of walls that he's willing to build. Here's one major point to ponder. Regardless of one's party's apparent benevolence and another's bold rhetoric, we must once again turn to the numbers, which do not lie. In Matthew's great book, Welcoming the Stranger, he outlines the history of immigration reform. And one worthy point of note is that the closest the country ever came to significant reform was during the George W. Bush administration, a Republican. His bill was the closest we've seen in decades that would have created a clean and clear legal path to citizenship. But alas, it was not carried by either party. Ask yourself, why might that have been? Is it possible that the voices of legislators' constituencies wouldn't allow it? If so, what does that say about our neighbors and friends and their heart for a growing nation that generationally thrives when we have population influx and population growth? Ask also, how is this issue related to national security and foreign humanitarian aid? Is there a connection between the two, a safe nation and a nation that is benevolent to outsiders? If so, how high does that rank in terms of weightiness for the country's flourishing and the president's direct involvement? Last paragraph. Under both candidates' parties and tenures, the issue of immigration and border security has continued to fester into what appears to be a malignant mass. But actually, it's not an issue that's impossible to address. The proposal of secure borders, law and order, plus a legal path to citizenship are not mutually exclusive. Here are some questions to pray through. Why have both parties and their presidential champions failed to pass significant policy charting a new path? Which candidate do you think has the best chances of welcoming the tired, the poor, the huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, while at the same time ushering in an era of the just arm of the law? Matthew, you've been so patient. I want to hear from you. Go ahead. What did you hear? What would you change? What would you edit?
Yeah. No, I really appreciate sort of beginning that with the really clear instructions biblically about how to treat immigrants. And even the acknowledgement that, I mean, that is not just an interpersonal dynamic. Like God had rules for the people of Israel that, part of that, the original law, Torah, were specific instructions for how to look out for those who are vulnerable. The orphan, the widow, the foreigner are often the groups that come up in the same passages. So, for example, Deuteronomy 24, God tells the Israelites they can go through their crops one time and they have to leave what remains for the orphan, the widow, the foreigner. This plan in place that was not a handout system, but a means by which these vulnerable people who, because of their status, were unlikely to be landowners, could meet their most basic need for food. And what I'm not saying by citing Deuteronomy 24 is saying that's what we need the Congress to do, or that's what we need a president to do, both because I don't think that was God's intention with those specific instructions. It wasn't for the United States of America. And I also don't think a gleaning system would solve all of our immigration challenges today. Obviously, it was written into a different context. But it does speak to the character of God. In Deuteronomy 10, it tells us that the reason that we are to love foreigners is because we follow a God who loves the foreigner and provides them with food and clothing. That's Psalm 146, very similar. It is rooted in the character of God whom we are called to obey and to emulate. So I think that part is sort of non-negotiable of how we treat our immigrant neighbor and that general disposition to being compassionate, to looking out for the needs of those who are vulnerable. But then I think it's also right that you note that God is also a God of order, and it is an appropriate function of government. We see government ordained by God in Romans chapter 13 and elsewhere to manage immigration, to ensure that we have secure borders, for example. A secure border isn't the same as a closed border that no one ever crosses. That's not a very realistic proposal in 2024. It wouldn't be good for the U.S. economy. It wouldn't be good for global missions. It wouldn't be good for a whole bunch of things. And yet, it's entirely right and appropriate for us to expect our government to have an orderly, secure process by which people come into the United States, and to have criteria on which our government bases the decisions on who is allowed in. Of course, the details of those criteria matter, and I think we can allow our faith to inform what we think those should be. So, for example, I've always said that one criteria that should matter is this idea that families ideally would be together. That doesn't mean there's not some exceptions to that. If someone has committed a violent crime, of course, they're going to be put in jail. And if they're a foreigner without citizenship, they'd potentially be deported. And that's appropriate. That's a consequence of a really serious infraction of law for the public safety. But generally speaking, I think we should have a bias towards how do we ensure that children are raised by their moms and dads and not taking a parent out of that process for an arbitrary reason. So I think our immigration laws should prioritize family unity whenever possible. Likewise, and I think you see this actually in some of the Old Testament law, there were borders in the Old Testament. I think that, there's nothing unbiblical about borders, but it is both right and fair for our government to have a secure border, to know who's coming in, to do everything reasonably possible to keep out anyone seeking to do harm and to enforce the law. And at the same time, we have laws in the United States that I think are right that say that if you are fleeing from a well-founded fear of persecution, such as because of your faith or because of your nationality, your ethnicity, your political opinion, that there would be a process by which you could claim asylum is the legal term, but basically seek refuge in the United States. Now, of course, the challenge of that is in the application, because I think most people in theory would agree we should keep out bad people and let in the people fleeing from the bad people. But to have the resources to know who is who and to make that assessment is a governmental process that actually requires some resources and some time, and some degree of subjective determination, because you can't always look at someone and determine the veracity of their claim of persecution. But I think that should be the goal of, I think we see it in scripture, to both affirm government's job in maintaining order, and we can affirm that as Christians. And that, I like where you ended that with this idea of having secure, orderly borders and having fair, functional legal processes, and even processes for those who have come to the United States and maybe overstayed a visa, or who crossed the border unlawfully. Most of the people who we're talking about in that category came 10, 15, 20 years ago, according to the Department of Homeland Security's data. What we've said for a long time at World Relief and our partners with the Evangelical Immigration Table is, because we affirm government's role, we affirm the rule of law, we don't think it should just be an amnesty that ignores the fact that people violated the law. On the other hand, because we think it's appropriate to show compassion where possible and to keep families together, we don't think removing 11 million people from the US, if that was even logistically possible, would be the prudent thing to do, because you'd be leaving behind 4 to 5 million US born children, for one thing, who would lose parents. What we've said is there ought to be a way for folks to come forward, acknowledge a violation of a law, of course, go through a criminal background check. If your only violation of law was crossing a border or overstaying a visa or some traffic violations, that would you'd be able to resolve that with a restitution payment, paying a fine for having violated the law, and then earn permanent legal status if you meet appropriate requirements. Whereas, of course, if you're the very small share of immigrants who have also committed violent crimes, you would face deportation. But I think having a system that both honors the law and honors the God's good design for government, while at the same time affirming God's good design for families and the inherent value of every person. I think one of the things, and this speaks to kind of the candidates in the current dynamic, is what should be a non-option for Democrats or Republicans is to speak about anyone in ways that really defies the idea that these are people made in the image of God. Even if you think for important, legal, orderly reasons we have to deport certain people, they are still human beings whom we should speak of in ways that honors their inherent dignity as people made in God's image. And we should never be slandering people, whether politicians or immigrants. We should make our case for the policy we think is right. But when to make our case, we are saying things that are demonstrably untrue, even if we didn't know it's untrue, which I think is important in the social media era, because it's really easy to click retweet or share about something that you see online. And maybe it seemed true to me, but that's not actually the standard. And I can fall into this. Sometimes it's the people who disagree with me on this policy question, who I'm likely to presume the worst of, or presume I know their motivations. This flip side can be true with people who will see something scary about immigrants and not verify that it is true, and yet click share. And that ultimately is slandering someone who in many cases is a brother or sister in Christ, who is in all cases a person made in the image of God, a neighbor whom Jesus commands us to love.
So I want to respond first to what you're saying about language and the power of ideas, and how that slander can actually be incredibly dangerous, especially with the click share. That's why we're doing this exercise. I just want to affirm what you're saying. Last Sunday, we had some live Q&A, and someone asked a great question. Should we just affirm a candidate's Christian status while ignoring their bad behavior? And it was such a great opportunity for myself and a fellow pastor to say, hey, that is a massive strike against our witness if we do that. Of course, we have to be equal opportunity critics. Of course, we have to not just look at someone who says they use the label of Christian, but to measure the fruit of their lives. And we went on and on, just punctuating it with the fact that if there's someone in my midst, let's talk about the neighbor level, who speaks out of both sides of their mouth, to me, they're untrustworthy. I mean, that's from like, so, and again, we're doing this whole exercise so that we can correct meta narratives, perhaps, and we can slide some objective truth in there. And I just affirm what you're saying, and the origin of what you said is good too, biblically, right? That these are image bearers, and so when a candidate, I think that probably, by the way, we could find, it's obviously thinly veiled who we're talking about right now, but as you look at Donald Trump supporters or conservative Christians. And you talk to them one-on-one behind the cliques and the social conformities, you're going to find that they might agree with you. Like, I just wish, and I've heard more than one conservative Christian say, I just wish that he would be a little bit more conservative even in his speech. And, that's the face I want to see. So, anyone who really is consistent will affirm, I think, what you're saying there. And I can see that point. It's well made.
Yeah. And I would add to that, I mean, like World Relief worked with some of our partners to commission a survey earlier this year from Lifeway Research to really understand what evangelical Christians think about immigration issues. 91% of evangelical Christians said they wanted immigration policies that affirm the dignity of every person. So I would actually say to former President Trump, of course, using some, what I would argue has at times been dehumanizing language will mobilize certain voters. It will also depress certain other voters, some of whom will still vote for you, but will vote for you in spite of that language, not because of it. And I think there's actually an opportunity for either candidate to have a clear policy that is based on respect for order and law, but also on compassion and not resorting to using dehumanizing language. I actually think there's a political lane for that. I think it's the morally right thing to do, but I also think it's a misrepresentation of, if the idea is we're going to win over evangelical Christian voters who are conservative by calling people animals or that sort of thing, I actually think it's a bad political calculation in addition to, I don't think we should speak of people in that way as Christians. And then in some of the policy questions, that poll found that 78% of evangelical Christians say they would support policies that included improvements to border security and an earned path to citizenship for immigrants in the country unlawfully who pay a fine and meet other qualifications. That's not 100%, but like, it's hard to get 78% of evangelical Christians to agree on the Apostles' Creed. So we're doing pretty well if you can get that level of unanimity.
I want to get to path to citizenship right now, actually, and just to put to rest the previous thing about slander and language and power of ideas. I think it's important for people to, you're an authority, man. That's why I'm so honored by your hour you're giving us today. You are the Christian authority on immigration. I'm trying to blow your head up there. I'm just saying, I put it before the listener to test these ideas and to look at the numbers. And I understand people could debate, how the number's used or how it's interpreted. It's history at this point. So much of what you do in Welcome to the Stranger is just history. Let me just repeat it to you. And I don't think it's revisionist in any way. So, but yeah, the power of ideas thing, if President Trump were listening to us, we would both agree that that's good political counsel, is that it would be advantageous you could even maybe potentially rope even more of your base in if some of the language was edifying. So let's talk about path to citizenship. I jotted down quickly. I'm sure you'll elaborate, but there's three, if not simple, succinct steps. Come forward, address the law/fine, earn legal status. And of course, the one caveat you gave was if there's something grievously against the law, then that precludes you from process. But and by the way, we can just celebrate that and punctuate that. We said 78% of Christians want firm border and legal path. That's what this episode is saying. We have agreement there. There's no question, full stop. That's what we're going after, and that's what makes sense. So, but talk about this legal path conversation a little more.
Yeah, I think in terms of legal paths, you both have what's the process for people who are already here, and then there's a question of how do we fix this system moving forward? Because the reality is, and this is not a Joe Biden or a Donald Trump problem, this is a problem going back decades. Our immigration system is set up in such a way that there's not enough visas to fill the needs of the US labor market. And so rather than very firmly enforcing the law, there's been a lot of looking the other way as people have either crossed the border unlawfully or overstayed a temporary visa or applied for asylum and with a fairly marginal case for asylum, which is really reserved in the law for people with a well-founded fear of persecution on account of specific reasons. So My view on that is yes, we should make it harder to immigrate illegally. We should have the goal of apprehending 100% of people who cross the border unlawfully. That's probably not ever going to happen completely, but we could get much closer to it. And to be fair, in 2003, our government estimates, the Department of Homeland Security estimates that they apprehended less than 1/3 of people who crossed the U.S.-Mexico border unlawfully. Now they're apprehending 75+% for the last several years in both the Biden and the Trump administrations, and actually going back to the Obama administration. Part of that is people are now trying to be caught. They want to seek asylum because they want to begin this process to show that they profess to have a well-founded fear of persecution. But we should continue to address that issue of security. We should have, at the same time, functional legal avenues. And I would say that could fit into a few categories. To meet the needs of the U.S. labor market, I think the Bible affirms work as a good thing that we can affirm. Like, it's not a malicious intent to want to come into work and fill a labor need and feed one's family. That's not an unlimited number, but we could have a number that was tied to what are the actual needs in our country and in particular industries. Two would be that value of family. How do we make sure that we are, whenever possible, facilitating family unity? So with a particular concern for children who biblically, I think we see the ideal circumstance for a child is to be raised by their mom and their dad together. That's not always a possibility, but when it is possible, we should not let the government get in the way of that. And then the third dynamic I think that should guide legal immigration is a concern for the value of human life. So when someone is fleeing a threat of persecution, which again can include people persecuted for their faith in Jesus. I've met lots of those people who that was their motivation to come and find refuge in the United States, whether as a refugee identified overseas or coming and seeking asylum, showing up on a temporary visa or at the border. There could be people fleeing political persecution. That's a large part of our national story. People fleeing persecution on account of their ethnicity. Or other reasons under the law. So I think those are, we adjust our legal immigration system that way. So it's harder to immigrate illegally. It's easier to immigrate legally. And then the sort of third leg of that stool is, well, what about the people who have already been here, who did come unlawfully or who came on a temporary lawful visa but didn't go back when they were supposed to? And by the way, that's half of the undocumented immigrants in the country, which I think gets kind of overlooked with all the focus on the border. But that's where I think that fine, allowing you to come forward, pay a fine, make things right. Again, with all the appropriate caveats, if you've committed a serious crime, you'd be excluded and deported. But the large majority of people in that circumstance, despite what you may have heard on television or social media, are not committing violent crimes. In fact, there's lots of good data on that. The best of it comes from the state of Texas, which is the only state that tracks the immigration legal status of felony convictions. And they consistently, year after year, find that immigrants have lower rates of crime per capita than native-born U.S. citizens, and actually those who are unlawfully present have lower rates of crime per capita than those who are lawfully present. And I don't think that anyone is arguing that that is because they're all morally superior, but because of the consequences at play. Because people know that if you're an immigrant, you don't only deal with a criminal justice system, maybe going to jail or prison or a fine, but you deal with the same criminal justice system, and then you deal with being deported to a country of origin that was sufficiently desperate that you risked a lot to leave from. And that's a good thing that people avoid crime because they don't want to be deported. That's a positive thing, but it is true. We find that consistently that, if it was not true, as we've seen a lot more immigrants come to the United States in the last several decades, we would expect crime rates to go up with that. And we've seen the opposite. And in fact, we've seen crime decline in some of the communities with the highest rates of immigration.
Yeah, so that's some data right there. That's some objective data for people just to get curious about and go test those sources and those numbers. The listener right now, just go find out if that matches, the other narratives you've heard or deeply held beliefs. Is it tied? That was one of the values in our intro of reading our statement was like cite sources. We want to cite scripture where we can, where it is not silent on these issues. But I'd say for these deeply held beliefs around immigration, yeah, it's important to cite sources and get that accurate information. That's really helpful, Matthew. I was inspired. Not an avid follower, and this was even before he was converted, but Russell Brand had this years ago on a podcast, and of course it's hilarious as a British guy. He almost exclusively talks about American politics, but he was saying, like, beware of the lie that it's too complicated to begin to fix. Like just even thinking about Congress or bureaucracy in general. He was like, that's a myth. Like we can start somewhere. And I think I honestly, yeah, maybe finance would be my second. It's in my top three, but up in that top three is immigration. Like I think it's got this label of impossibly complex. Like I wrote in the letter, it's got the appearance of being a malignant mass, but can you just speak to that and about, even one of the candidates, probably it was Kamala, I can't remember, was like, we have laws, we're just not following them. I probably both sides might agree. That's why I liked that statement. Speak to anything you're hearing from that.
Yeah, well, on the first level, I think I actually really appreciate the acknowledgement that immigration is complicated because the people who want to tell you this is simple on one side or the other are lying to you. It is extremely complicated because there's 40 plus million immigrants in the United States, and they don't all have the same story. And treating them as though they were all the same story is actually pretty unhelpful. Um, but the flip side of that is it to feel like, oh, this is so complicated that it can never be solved. And I will grant you, we ever have a perfect immigration system that is totally ideal for every US citizen and every immigrant? No, like there will always be challenges, but can we, on an iterative level, make it a better system that is more in the interest of both national security, our national economy, and the well-being of immigrants? I think there's a lot that we can do. And people have been trying this for in good faith on both sides of the aisle. I mean, you mentioned in the introduction back under the George W. Bush administration, which makes me feel very old now that I go and talk to most of our staff at World Relief are 20 years younger than me at this point, I think, and are 15 years younger than me. And I talk about the Bush administration, and their eyes kind of glaze over like when my parents talked about Nixon. So I realized we have to go back in history a ways. But under the Bush administration, there was a really good faith effort. It was started by Senator John McCain and Senator Ted Kennedy, a Republican and a Democrat, who didn't agree on a whole lot, but found ways like what could they each give on to find a solution. And that became the groundwork for a bill that passed the Senate in 2006, but unfortunately, from my perspective, never passed the House of Representatives. And President Bush supported that effort. Fast forward a few years, there was I think another good faith effort in the Obama administration that President Obama supported that had a number of Republicans behind it, as well as a number of Democrats in the Senate. Passed the Senate once again, didn't get a vote in the House of Representatives. And it was basically that outline I talked about, like a lot of money for border security and some specific strategies for improving border security, some new visas to fix the legal immigration system, and an earned legalization process with a fine. And the exact amount of the fine varied from 2006 to 2013 to even, I mean, that bill essentially has been introduced again in the current Congress. It's Congresswoman Salazar, a Republican out of Miami, and Congresswoman Escobar, a Democrat out of Texas, who have a bill they call the Dignity Act that is with one addition, which is they've acknowledged that one thing that's changed since 2013 is the asylum system is not functioning adequately right now in a way that wasn't a central challenge back in 2013. So they've said, hey, we want to hold on to asylum. We want to hold on to protecting people with a well-founded fear of persecution, but just sending hundreds of thousands of people into the United States with a court date 4 or 5 years into the future is clearly not a very good strategy for that. So we need a process to adjudicate asylum claims in a timelier fashion that still ensures due process. And, I don't think their solution is perfect, but I think it would be such a massive improvement over the status quo. And it's also a much better solution than what some other folks have said, which is, well, let's stop asylum, which is sort of, some people will be sent back to be killed for their faith in Jesus, but that's just, we have to accept that in order to have a more secure situation. We really think we're a big, powerful, smart country. There are ways to do both, to ensure secure borders while also affirming the dignity of every human life. And that is a motivation for protecting those with a genuine fear of persecution and even of death for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. So I just want to summarize a couple things that we've heard now twice that are coming through so clearly, Matthew. First, there's like almost guiding values or pillars rather, and it's the security, economy, and refugee/humanity is what I wrote down. And that's not exact, but that's like some great pillars for us to process. And then even as you flesh that out, it's like, money for security. Okay, good. There's that law and order. New visas, that's, legal path. And then legalization plus fine for, like you said, those, 11 million to 40 million who are already here with different, obviously, stories and contingencies. I mean, like here's something that has brand capacity. The Dignity Act. And yet I've never heard of it. I'll admit I'm not following it as closely as you, and maybe not even halfway. But boy, this stuff just doesn't get airtime, man. I mean, it's right there. It's got color, it's got detail. Like you said, it would move the needle even this one iteration for asylum, and yet, man, we're just not no hablo. Like doesn't translate.
Yeah, no, I mean that is the frustration of working in policy space is there's this idea of like, well, there's no solution to this. There's some really thoughtful solutions to this, and some of them are roughly the same solutions we've been talking about for 20 years. But that particular bill, for example, it's not been supported by either the Republican leadership in the House or the Democratic leadership in the House. So it's kind of members on the margins of their party, I think, doing the hard work of legislating, which means talking to the people across the aisle. And because today in the House of Representatives, and this will almost certainly be true after the election, you're going to need to find some sort of bipartisan agreement. That's certainly going to be true in the US Senate, if not in the House, to pass legislation. And that's how we change laws in this country. That's our constitutional system. I think there's some brilliance in that system. But it's really easy. And this goes to the presidential discussion too. I think you should always be asking when you hear a presidential candidate claim, I'm going to do on any issue, but I can speak to immigration well, I'm going to do this and that and this and that, to ask if they actually have the authority to do that. So, for example, the president has certain really broad authority on parts of immigration, like the refugee ceiling. How many refugees are allowed in the United States? The Congress gave the president that authority back in 1980. The president can set the ceiling at 0, which is actually what former President Trump has says. I mean, he said he will suspend refugee resettlement on day 1, which is something I would personally very much disagree with. But there's other things that the president will say they're going to do. Like, I'm going to give people a path to citizenship. Kamala Harris has said that. Only if she can get the Congress to go along with her can she do that. I mean, President Bush said the same thing was a goal, and so did President Obama. President Trump has not expressed that as a policy goal, at least on the same, for at least the large number of immigrants that President Bush or Obama did. But I think just acknowledging there's certain things, likewise, when President Trump says he's going to do the greatest deportation in American history, he has some authority to do that if someone is deportable under the law, but he's limited by the resources that Congress appropriates for that purpose. And Congress has never come near to appropriating all the funds that would be necessary to deport all the people who are undocumented, who are unauthorized and could be deported under the law. And then there's other people who, if you want to deport a refugee and they've been lawfully admitted and they've not done anything to violate the terms of their legal protections, you can't just simply carry out a deportation. There's legal reasons you can't do that.
Okay, so that you took the question right out of my mouth. That's where I wanted to make sure we camped out eventually, was the president's direct role or influence in this topic. As with all top 8 or 9 voter guide issues we're going to address, that needs to come to the surface. To what extent can the president influence these things? And so I heard you say refugee ceiling. Legal path is totally contingent on Congress. Deportation to an extent, but also contingent on Congress, and it's costly. So if we're going to use those dollars, let us, use them most effectively, would be the pushback. And then you've talked about courts more than once today. Are any of these judges appointed by the president?
Yeah, immigration judges are usually, and they're not part of the judicial branch, which is kind of an interesting. I mean, that might only be interested to like political scientists who look at American government, but immigration judges who have a very important role are part of the executive branch of the government. They report ultimately to the Attorney General. So that appointment that the president makes, which is Senate confirmed, so there's a little bit of a congressional check there as well, it does have a serious impact on immigration policy. Same with whoever becomes the Secretary of Homeland Security. There is a great deal that is guided by law and under the authority of law, but is ultimately are interpretations of law that can be made at the executive level. So maybe this is in the weeds, but one example of that would be to qualify for asylum under U.S. law, you have to demonstrate, you have to get to the U.S. and you have to prove that you have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of your race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or membership in a particular social group. Well, when Attorney General Jeff Sessions was in his position, he used his authority to clarify that your social group could not be a grounds for winning an asylum claim if you were fleeing from private violence, meaning if you were fleeing gang violence, you couldn't make the argument that it was part of a social group. Attorney General Merrick Garland in the Biden administration changed that back. Now, that doesn't mean everyone fleeing gang violence qualifies for asylum, but it does mean an immigration attorney isn't precluded from making that argument, and the judge's hands aren't tied in the way that they were under Attorney General sessions. So those sort of appointments and the way even the law itself, the law did not change on asylum between the Trump and the Biden administration, but the approval rate for asylum changed pretty significantly, largely as a result of that one interpretation of the law that Congress passed back in 1980.
Okay, good. So we will add that to the list. I have four things here: the refugee ceiling, legal path with Congress, deportation with Congress, appointed immigration judges, along with their appointments of attorney general. Those are explicitly executive. So I actually would say this is quite a bit of influence, right? I mean, it's like, I don't know, you're not saying it's not, but I would say this tilts the balance if we're looking at 50% of who's impacting it.
Relative, I mean, I'll just say personally, and World Relief really only focuses on a few issues, but personally, the issues that are important to me, and there's lots of issues, not just the ones that I work on every day that are important to me. Immigration, and especially refugees, is probably the one where the president has the most unilateral authority.
Wow.
That
Okay, so
some foreign policy decisions, clearly as commander in chief, that's also true.
that's a profound estimate. Now, the last one, and I know it's related to all these four, that I wonder about is funding, which again, that's a congressional participation. It's not like the president just gets to do that unilaterally.
Yeah, funding for the most part is the congressional prerogative. Now, sometimes the president does submit a budget. In the last several years, the Congress immediately ignores it and does their own budget. But I would say the way the president, and I'm not speaking of President Biden necessarily, but of any president interacts with Congress is also really important. I mean, I will speak to President Biden. I liked President Biden's immigration proposal that he came up with on day one. I haven't seen a lot of effort to actually negotiate with Republicans to persuade them to pass it into law. I think and maybe he doesn't have the political capital to do that. Probably at this point, he clearly doesn't. But that's something I think President Bush actually put a lot of political capital in. It still didn't work, but I appreciated that. But it has to come from a place of negotiation as well, of what could we negotiate. And President Biden did try to negotiate some things on asylum and border security that I think were a good faith effort on both the Republicans involved and the Democrats. It's not a perfect proposal, and it failed earlier this year. But I think that was a real effort to resolve some very serious challenges with the way that asylum is processed. And if you read World Relief's statement on our website and were confused if we were for or against it, that was a little bit intentional. Like, we said this and this and this and this are good, and we have concerns about this and this element of this proposal. But I really want to affirm bipartisan sitting down at a table and working out what can we agree upon. And unfortunately, I think that's too rare and rarely rewarded in our political system today.
Yeah, it's a salient theme, and I'm happy to pause and again punctuate what you're saying, that there's a great deal of sweat equity that's required here across the chambers of Congress, but also the president relative to Congress. That we do an activity around here for families and leaders, like show us your calendar and we'll show you your values, right? And so certainly our leaders, the highest level of leaders in Congress and the president, should be able to say the same thing. I've spent XYZ dollar, time, energy, effort towards this top 10 voter guide issue. And it will not get done without that. So I think that's really good. Before we move to the local level, Matthew, I want to. I'd be a sucker. I'd be a chump if I didn't. If I avoided this question altogether. And I'm going to ask it in a creative way. And I think you're the guy that can play along. I would like you to share one thing, at least, if not some things, that are effective about a wall. I'm talking about a wall here. Something that may be effective about a wall, and some things that may be not so effective about a wall. And I'll give you carte blanche there, but I bet you could probably speak to both sides of that fence.
I mean, I think there are places along the U.S.-Mexico border where it is very prudent to have a wall or a fence, or sometimes we have two layers of fences. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I interact with Border Patrol quite a bit, and almost all of them are glad that there's walls in some places, or fences, barriers of some sort. And most of them, I think, would also affirm that it wouldn't make sense across the whole of the border. Like, if you're in an urban area like Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, where you've got basically two cities running right up against each other, if you didn't have that large fence, or a couple layers of fences in some cases, people would cross over it because it turns out fences are actually not the most modern technology. Like it does not stop people from entering the United States. It slows them down. And in a city context, you need them to be slowed down so that the Border Patrol can get to them and stop them from kind of, quickly become dissolving into the population. In a super rural area that's a 2-day walk to civilization, the sensors that we have across the border are adequate to tell us that someone entered, and that there's plenty of time for the Border Patrol to go and find that person without necessarily having a wall. And then just for like geologic reasons, walls are complicated as well. Like in the Texas border with Mexico, the legal border is the Rio Grande River. And you cannot build a wall in the middle of a river. Like it will erode and fall down. So inherently the wall is north of the river. But what I think a lot of people miss is that to seek asylum, which is why most people are crossing the border unlawfully in the last few years, it is not to evade the Border Patrol and sneak past them. It is to find the Border Patrol to begin an asylum request. Well, you have the right to begin that asylum request when you are north of the river, but still south of the fence. And I have physically seen that happen. I've seen the Border Patrol processing people who are on the south side of the what's, we think of as the border wall in Texas. I've been to a church that is south of the border fence because there are, parts where the river meanders quite a bit and they have to build it quite a ways north of the actual border. And then you have U.S. citizen communities that have this complicated dynamic of having to go through the border fence to get to their house or to their church. So it is complicated, but I think walls have a purpose. I think walls are not a panacea, solve your immigration challenges. And even people will try to go biblically, like, well, Nehemiah built a wall, and then others will be like, well, Joshua tore down a wall. I don't think either of those was God's instructions for the United States government in terms of a border policy. But I think we can affirm God does give government a responsibility to ensure security and order, and walls are sometimes a part of that. Most Border Patrol agents would tell you they're only one part of it. There's a lot of technology that is, frankly, a lot more advanced than a barrier that is useful. And most Border Patrol agents, in my experience, would tell you what they need most is more people. And that, even that, it's money. It's also like they actually have had more money than they have. They can't hire enough people to all the Border Patrol positions that are open because it's a really hard job that not a ton of Americans want.
Yeah, so a couple really important things. First, I'm going to repeat back what I heard. I think that is pretty funny. Thinking about how ancient that a wall is ancient technology. That's pretty good. But I appreciate your balanced summary that it's a combination of sensors, walls, tech, and people. Maybe chiefly amongst all those things. So, excuse me. And so that's the whole story. Again, we're talking about ideas. We're talking about rhetoric. We're cutting through that. We're trying to be objective. You are boots on the ground. I'm talking to someone who's been there, who stood there. As you talked about that church, I thought about our dear friend Christine from Redemption Church. She's talked about that church. You guys might have been there together. I don't know, but she was there and saw what you saw. And so this is frontline stuff. That's the first thing. It's a mix of, we're talking about policy. We want to clear the narrative, sensors, walls, technology, and people. The second thing that I think is profound, and now you've said this twice, that's why it's jumping out at me, is like particularly, let's say it's asylum, which is, again, by the numbers, the vast majority, asylum. These people want to be found. You said it twice. They want to be found. I'm not in the news every single day, and that's probably on purpose. But I can say for sure that the most searing and graphic images in my mind that will last forever from the last, really from the last 4 to 6 years, are about bodies, floating in that river and others, and young and old, and I think that's really, really tragic. And, as a father, it moves me even now as I think about it. But it simply drives the point these folks, and I don't know the crossing at the river versus, Juarez and, down here in Southern California. Obviously, it's different lengths, but what we do know from well-documented accounts is that it's a harrowing journey. It's not something that you would engage in unless you really did think you were going to die staying in your current situation. So, I'm elaborating on the point that you made more simply, but I think it does need to be emphasized.
I think that speaks to, like, wouldn't it be a better system when we have labor needs in the United States to have a visa available where you could go to the consulate in your country of origin and be background checked there and vetted there and then come on an airplane, like that would just be a win-win for everyone, except for the cartels that run the smuggling industry. They would lose. Um,
Yeah.
and really, on an American political debate, the only people opposed to that are not the people who are concerned about border security. It's the people who think we should not have more immigrants at all. And I think that's a very small fringe of the country, actually, in both parties, who really are just against immigrants of all backgrounds. But through some perverse political dynamics, they sometimes end up blocking really sensible immigration policies that would say, hey, let's direct people to lawful forms of migration, which would be their preference and clearly a more orderly system, minimize security risks for the United States, and maximize the economic benefits. Because most economists will agree that our country benefits enormously from the immigrants who are workers in our economy, who are entrepreneurs, who are taxpayers, who are consumers. Like you don't grow an economy by shrinking a population. And there's a several allied countries in Europe and East Asia who we could ask about how that works, who tend to have less of a history of immigration than the United States does.
Yeah, that's profound. And again, we're on narrative in a way. Unfortunately, I don't remember who cited this first, but unfortunately, it's the 10% extreme poles who are the loudest. But there's a vast majority of us in the 80% middle that would say, yeah, they're and even let's say a so-called conservative value to champion, marketplace and economics and population growth. Man, we're for family. If we're speaking to that side of the base on the right. So those things are common sense values that should lead to common sense policies. In the last 5 minutes we have here, I know this is so personal to you and doesn't do it justice, but we were here to talk about immigration. You're such a local guy, Matthew, neighboring. I wish you would speak to that, just from a values level and an anecdotal level about what just how you and your wife and your kids have sought to model this.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that's what keeps me engaged for almost 2 decades at this point on these questions is it matters to people whom I care a lot about. I mean, it affects their lives profoundly. Like I have colleagues and close friends who are dreamers, who are immigrants who were brought here as young kids, whose ability to work lawfully and finish college or use the college degree that they earned is dependent upon what happens with particular policy positions. Or, Haitian immigrants were in the news in some pretty ugly ways out of these stories in Ohio a few weeks ago. And I immediately thought of the Haitian families that have showed up at my church in the last month or two, who I've had over at my house for dinner, and have are here lawfully, by the way. And I think that's really important. Like that goes to that slander question. Like you can think that we shouldn't have a law that lets them be here, but don't blame the people for availing themselves of a legal process that exists under the law. Or even these asylum questions. I mean, I have a close friend who I talked to yesterday, who's a pastor from Mexico who fled his church and his home when being kind of on the line between two warring cartels, and his commitment to caring for people regardless of where they were from and their background got him into trouble with these cartels, and they killed someone in his church and threatened to kill him next. And the police kind of quietly told him, "We can't protect you." And he made the really difficult decision to go to the border and waited there in a church-based shelter, very much like some that World Relief helped support in Tijuana, for several weeks. Eventually was allowed in to pursue asylum, and he's in that process now and will be probably for years. And I think he's got a very good claim. I think has a well-founded fear of persecution. I don't think when he asked me to pray for him, it's all a part of an elaborate ruse. But I also know that it is a super difficult process, and holding on to some process for him while also acknowledging that not everyone who shows up at the border has that story, I think it helps me appreciate the complexity of this. I mean, I go to a Spanish-speaking church where these policy decisions actually have very serious impacts on people who are teaching my kids Sunday school and are, are just people who I know and love and care about. And I think if more people had that personal connection to this issue and to the complexity, I also know that they're not all perfect people. I'm like, I think that on the one side of advocacy, it's sort of want to frame this as demons and the others as angels. Actually, they're human beings made in the image of God, sinful, just like the rest of us. And we need structures that can, just as we do for US citizens, that can make order out of a complicated situation.
Yeah, amen. We hope to follow this up with a part two with our Spanish-speaking pastor, Francisco, who we were fortunate enough to have front row seats to his journey. And it was 20 plus years and tens of thousands of dollars. An unbelievable mess. And yet we got to sit in that room in Los Angeles, the so-called legalization ceremony or swearing in ceremony. And it's a profound moment. I'll never forget it. And obviously you've shared that moment so many times. Last question here at the top of the hour for you, Matthew. And we talked about this last week on abortion. You know, it's much easier to carry a loud opinion, especially with a click and a share. It's much harder to incarnate this, to model this where you live, work, and play. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, it's still true. It's true on abortion. It's true on immigration. It's just easier. Well, it's simpler, right? Like it takes 10 seconds to read something and click and feel like you've taken your righteous position. And that might be the righteous position, but that's not the fullness of what our God calls us to. We're called to love our neighbors as ourselves. We're called to speak out for those who cannot speak for themselves in Proverbs 31. We're called to seek justice and rescue the vulnerable from the oppressor in Jeremiah. And that is why I hope people vote, and I hope they vote in informed ways. And I'm not telling them who to vote for, but be informed as you make those decisions. But also don't think that you've done your duty every 4 years by casting one vote. Like, call World Relief in Orange County and find ways to volunteer, or connect to the Spanish-speaking church there and ask, is there a way I could be connected to this relationally? And both learn and serve. And likewise, if you are passionate about unborn lives, like, work with people who are spending themselves to help make it possible for moms who are in a hard situation to carry a child to term. It's great to have an opinion on the law. Those questions do matter. But that's not the only way that we live out our values on these issues.
Yeah, amen. We're going to leave it right there. I won't add to that, but I will thank you so much, Matthew, for your time today. God bless you and your wife and your kids and your neighborhood and your very important work. Thank you again so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it.
Thanks again for listening to the Watermark OC Church Conversation Podcast. We hope and pray that something has touched your heart, has given you something new to think about, and we would love to continue the conversation with you on a personal level. Please reach out to us, watermarkoc.com, and click on Coffee with a Pastor, and we will continue the conversation.